Hello everyone, welcome back to History 2001, Launching America. In our last video, we discussed the Americas' indigenous people, the people who have come to be known as Native Americans or Indians. In this video, we're going to discuss the people who came to the Americas by water around the end of the 15th century, Common Era. We will consider the first Europeans who came to the Americas, who they were, and why they came here. You're probably wondering, why are we talking about Europeans and their lives in the Old World? Isn't this class about America? Well, you're not wrong to ask yourself this question, so let me tell you why we're going to be discussing this background information. First, when discussing the migration of peoples, for example, Europeans who migrated to the Americas, scholars talk about two big issues, push factors and pull factors. Push factors are issues or struggles that a people face in their homeland, which motivate them to want to leave their ancestral lands in order to find a home in a different part of the world. They include things like a lack of land for settlement, resource shortages, famines, diseases, warfare, religious persecution, and oppressive governments, among other issues. Leaving one's country, family, and culture and making a difficult and dangerous journey by sea to an unfamiliar land can be a daunting experience. So knowing the factors that led European colonists and migrants to leave their homelands is very important. Second, we must consider pull factors. Pull factors are benefits that a new land or country offers to potential immigrants. They can include things like cheap, plentiful land for settlement, abundant natural resources, readily available employment, and freedom from oppressive institutions. Later waves of migrants can also add chain migration, the reuniting with immediate and extended family who have already migrated to a new land from the old country, as a pull factor as well. Any combination of the aforementioned factors motivated the European colonists, migrants, refugees, and settlers who came to the Americas from the late 15th century onward. Keep these terms, push factors and pull factors, in mind as we continue in this course. As the immigrants who come to the American colonies, and eventually the United States, came for many of the same reasons that motivated the first Europeans to come to the Americas. I want you all to see the continuities and the patterns in immigration over the years. But I also want you all to see change over time as well, and how migrants' motivations shifted as time went on. Who were the first Europeans to arrive in the Americas? The first confirmed European arrivals to the Americas came not in the late 1400s as you might think, but much earlier, around the year 1000 of the Common Era. These first Europeans to come to America were the Vikings. The Vikings, seafaring raiders from Scandinavia, were skilled sailors and shipbuilders, settling Iceland between 850 and 875 CE, and they settled Greenland in the late 900s, although scholars debate whether Greenland should be considered a part of Europe or North America. What you all need to know is that the Vikings reached the mainland of North America, what is now Newfoundland, around the year 1000 of the Common Era. Leif Erikson, son of the famous Viking explorer Eric the Red, was determined to establish a settlement in North America. He would have called this land Vineland because of the blueberry and cranberry plants that grew spontaneously on what would later be known as the Canadian coast. Iceland and Greenland were very cold and had poor, rocky soil, so the fertile fields of Vineland were a massive pull factor for Vikings like Leif Erikson. The push factors that Leif and his companions faced were increased centralization of the Scandinavian society, as the Norse people adopted Christianity and created a more united political system. Many Vikings fled their homelands during this period for Iceland and Greenland, and most determined to set out for Vineland. Leif Erikson stepped ashore on Vineland in the year 1000 and peacefully traded with the Native American peoples of the Beothuk culture who called the land home. The Vikings called the Native Americans Skraelings, although the exact etymology of this term is unclear. Some think that Skraeling may have been a reference to the Native Americans' copper-colored skin, while others think it may have been an onomatopoeia for the high-pitched battle cry they would make. While Leif's interaction with the so-called Skraelings was peaceful, later interactions would not be. Leif's brother, Thorvald, sailed to Vineland in 1004, and in a surprise attack killed several of the Beothuk people, who responded by attacking his ships and killing him with an arrow. The Vikings returned in 1009, led by Thorfinn Karlsefni, who brought 3 ships and as many as 250 other Vikings with him, suggesting he was preparing to establish a permanent colony in Vineland. While relations between Thorfinn and the Skraelings were initially peaceful, and the Vikings traded the Native Americans' milk and dyed wool for animal skins, the relations quickly turned sour after Thorfinn's bull got loose and began to chase the Skraelings. The natives responded, attacking Thorfinn's party, killing several of them and forcing them to retreat to their ships. The sagas, the best written records we have of the Vikings' exploration of the Americas, suggest that the Skraelings attacked the Norsemen with a type of siege engine, perhaps a catapult or a ballista, once again highlighting Native Americans' technological sophistication, especially when it came to warfare. Archaeological evidence backs up the Viking saga's claims that the Norsemen reached the New World. The evidence also indicates that while the Vikings established outposts in the New World, none of them were inhabited for long periods of time, most likely because they were unable to establish peaceful relations with the native peoples who lived in Newfoundland, as attested by the sagas. In the 19th century, some people thought that the Vikings may have established temporary settlements in New England and further to the south, although more recent archaeological analysis of these sites suggests they were actually Native American in origin. The Norse people failed to establish permanent settlements on the mainland of North America, and they would ultimately abandon Greenland in the 1300s CE. The Norse people left Greenland for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons they left was due to climate change, a cooling trend that made the cold, harsh land of Greenland even more difficult to inhabit. Additionally, one of the Norse Greenlanders' most important economic industries, the harvesting of narwhal tusks, began to be severely undercut by the emerging ivory trade, as European traders from Portugal began to explore the West African coast and trade with the people there. So, in the grand scheme of things, the Norse people's settlements in both Newfoundland and Greenland were temporary. Now that we've discussed the first Europeans who came to the Americas, let's skip forward almost 500 years to the end of the 15th century. By the 1400s, Europeans had been trading with East Asia, what they called the Indies, for centuries. This trade took place almost entirely over land, using a millennia-old trade route called the Silk Road. The Silk Road allowed goods and people to pass between Europe and the Far East, greatly benefiting and having a profound impact on the civilizations of China, Korea, the Indian subcontinent, and the Middle East, and of course, Europe. Transporting goods across the Silk Road could be a very lucrative endeavor, as the route was very long, being over 4,000 miles. The terrain was rough, crossing arid deserts, high mountains, and desolate plains. Before the development of steam power and the internal combustion engine, all cargo being transported by land had to be moved by muscle power, on the backs of donkeys, in carts pulled by oxen, or in packs carried by humans. Additionally, traders on the Silk Road could be vulnerable to attacks from bandits. Traders were also forced to pay local warlords for safe passage on the trail through their lands. These payments, which cut into their profits, were a mix between a bribe, a toll, and protection money. Traders moving east to Asia brought wool, iron tools, and precious metals to sell in Asian markets. On their return trip, the traders brought spices, jade, and of course, silk, a soft and easily dyed cloth that was a major status symbol for medieval Europeans, who generally wore rough, coarse textiles made of wool or flax, linen. Additionally, the Silk Road allowed ideas to travel from east to west. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam passed eastward along the Silk Road, and technological developments like gunpowder, paper, compasses, and block printing came to the west. Europeans would experiment with and adapt these technologies, all of which would play a role in their colonization of the Americas. Marco Polo, an Italian-Venetian merchant, traversed the Silk Road from 1271 to 1295 and recounted the riches of Asia in his travel narrative, The Travels of Marco Polo. Polo brought high-quality Asian goods back to Venice, and his travels convinced many Italian traders and nobles that the key to European financial success lie in trade with Asia. One Italian trader who was inspired by Marco Polo was named Cristobal Colombo, better known as Christopher Columbus, but we'll talk more about him later. While the Silk Road brought many benefits to Europe, primarily in the form of luxury goods and new ideas, it also brought certain things that made life more difficult for medieval Europeans. The Mongol Empire, under leaders like Genghis Khan, advanced westward, roughly along the Silk Road, threatening European cities like Vienna during the 1200s, shortly after Marco Polo made his journey to Asia. The most disastrous thing for Europeans that came from the Silk Road was not a people group or a good, but a disease, the Bubonic Plague. While some scholars think the Bubonic Plague, caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis, may have reached Europe as early as the 500s during the reign of Byzantine Empire Justinian I, the greatest pandemic of bubonic plague that Europe ever experienced occurred from 1347 to 1351 CE. The Yersinia pestis bacteria jumped species from arboreal rodents to rats somewhere in Central Asia, possibly Mongolia, although scholars debate the plague's exact origin. In recent years, scholars have come around to the idea that the plague was introduced to Europeans on purpose by the Mongols during the siege of Kaffa, present-day Crimea, in 1345. The Mongols used catapults to launch the bodies of plague victims into the city, in an early instance of biological warfare. Once inside the city, fleas on the bodies of the dead bit and infected Kaffa's rodents, which then went aboard European, specifically Italian, Genoese ships. Once they reached Europe, the rats were bitten by European fleas, and these fleas then bit humans, spreading the disease rapidly through Europe's urban trade centers. To make matters worse, the bubonic plague bacteria would mutate and become aerosolized, being spread by coughs and sneezes, only increasing the disease's rate of transmission. The bubonic plague presented with symptoms including high fever, black, swollen lymph nodes, called buboes, from which we get the name of the disease, and ultimately death. While the bubonic plague has a 90% survival rate with modern medical treatment, including antibiotics, a medieval European afflicted with the plague had about an 80% chance of death, depending on their age, level of health, and other circumstances. The plague, also known as the Black Death, killed at least 50 million Europeans, about 50 to 60% of Europe's population. The disease's rapid spread across Europe and Europeans' inability to understand this pandemic's causes or treat the afflicted led many to think that the plague hailed the apocalypse or divine judgment for humanity's sins. While the plague subsided in the late 1300s, its disastrous effects would have a profound impact on European culture, particularly its perspectives on death, disease, and religion that would be felt for centuries to come. Medieval European society, particularly the Church's failure to contain and mitigate the plague, would help to inspire the Renaissance, a period in which Europeans emphasized learning and study, especially the study of secular Greco-Roman texts, in order to add to the sum total of human knowledges. In some cases, they used this knowledge to question long-held Christian beliefs. At the same time, many church leaders supported the Renaissance, patronizing artists and scholars who were part of the movement, like Michelangelo, who painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in 1512. The pace of the Renaissance would advance over time due to technological developments, like Johannes Gutenberg's printing press in 1440, which allowed books and knowledge to be disseminated far more rapidly than was previously thought possible. In 1453, about a century after the end of the Black Death, the great city of Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine civilization, the final remnant of the Roman Empire, fell to the Islamic Ottoman Turks. The loss of Constantinople was a traumatic effect for medieval Europeans, the vast majority of whom were Christians, although they followed the Catholic Church of Rome, rather than the Eastern Orthodox Church, which was based in Constantinople. The fall of Constantinople was a significant event in European history. While Eastern Orthodox and Western Roman Christians had not always gotten along, they had a long tradition of putting their differences aside and coming together to fight non-Christian foes, as seen during the Crusades and other events. Yet, in the fall of Constantinople, their attempts to work together to prevent Turkish expansion failed, shifting the balance of power in Eastern Europe away from Christian Europeans and towards the Islamic Ottomans, who would rule Southeast Europe for centuries, and would even try to capture Vienna in 1529, and again in 1683. The Ottoman Empire would officially come to an end after the First World War and the creation of Turkey as a modern nation-state in 1923. While Christian Europeans would make alliances to fight common enemies in the future, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 was the beginning of the end of this type of religious-based alliance in Europe. From here on, Europeans would increasingly come to identify with their nation, i.e. France, Spain, England, etc., although religion would still be important. It would be less of a unifying issue. The fall of Constantinople, while it reshaped European balances of power and diplomatic relations, it also helped to inspire a new European military culture. For centuries, medieval Europeans had relied on static military formations and large, slow armies that would fight from behind castles or thick city walls. Constantinople's walls, once the jewel of European fortifications and thought to be impenetrable, were no match for the Ottomans' use of gunpowder, specifically their large cannons called bombards, which pounded much of the city's walls to dust while also killing its defenders. Additionally, the Ottomans used dynamic, aggressive tactics, like taking their ships apart and moving them over land in order to circumvent the Byzantines' naval fortifications. The fall of Constantinople taught Europeans that if they were going to resist the Ottoman expansion, they would have to adopt and even improve upon Eastern military technologies like gunpowder. They would also have to develop more dynamic, flexible tactics. These revelations would help to initiate Europe's so-called military revolution, in which European strategists, tacticians, and scientists developed new weapons, tactics, and strategies, helping to make Europe the world's dominant military power. Many of the technologies developed in the European military revolution would play a major role in the colonization of the Americas, but we will discuss such things in future videos. Beyond the military developments, perhaps the greatest impact that the loss of Constantinople had on 15th century Europeans was of an economic and intellectual nature. For centuries, Europeans had relied on Constantinople as the western trailhead of the Silk Road, from which they gathered both goods and ideas from the east. The loss of Constantinople meant that Europeans, if they wanted to continue to trade with Asia, would have to find a new route to the Far East, one that went not over land, but across the water. Additionally, scholars, scientists, and artists, and learned people in general from a variety of backgrounds fled Constantinople during the siege of the city and afterwards. They brought Greek and Roman texts and knowledge with them to Western Europe. These scholars and the knowledge they brought helped to speed up the pace of the ongoing Renaissance movement, in which Europeans had gained an increased interest in Greco-Roman knowledge, initially with the support of the Roman Catholic Church. Over time, however, these discoveries would undermine the Catholic Church's authority and would inspire the Reformation. During the Reformation, Christian reformers, most notably men like Martin Luther, a German monk, called for reform within the Catholic Church. Luther issued his 95 Theses in 1517, calling for reform. And when his proposition failed, Luther began a new church, separated from Rome. The Reformation saw the Roman Catholic Church torn apart, and a series of new Protestant, they were called this because they were protesting the Catholic Church, sects, including the Lutherans, Calvinists, and Anglicans, be formed. The Reformation divided Christian Europe. Where European Christians had once come together to fight non-Christian enemies, now they fought each other in a series of bloody religious wars, which divided Christendom and helped to give rise to the modern European nation-states we know today. I mention the Reformation and Europe's religious wars because these developments would have a profound impact on how the European powers would approach their colonization of the New World, as you will see in future videos. Now that we have discussed some very important background information, you should have a basic understanding of the challenges that Europeans faced on the eve of the Age of Exploration. You should understand why they would want to leave Europe and explore the world by sea. In the 1400s, the people of the Iberian Peninsula were best positioned to become the continent's premier maritime explorers. As I mentioned before, it was the Portuguese who first began to sail south and east to the West African coast, using a fusion of Eastern and Western maritime technologies to improve their ships. The Portuguese began constructing sailing vessels called caravels, which, unlike previous European ships, had multiple masts and triangular sails, and were powered by wind rather than rowers. Multiple triangular sails could be more easily adjusted than a single square one, allowing for beating and tacking, or sailing windward against the wind. Caravels were fast, sturdy, and maneuverable vessels that could travel further and faster than oar-powered galleys that had been used for centuries on the Mediterranean Sea. Using their caravels, the Portuguese would set up fortified trading posts called Fatorias, or factories, which were essentially proto-colonies from which the Portuguese traded goods, selling weapons in exchange for ivory, gold, and eventually enslaved Africans. Elmina, built on the coast of what is now Ghana, was one of the Portuguese most important factories in Africa. Portuguese leaders, most notably Prince Henry the Navigator, sponsored exploratory voyages and factories, with the hope that Portuguese vessels would find a route to the Indies by sailing around the coast of Africa. Portuguese explorer Bartholomew Diaz sailed around Africa's Cape Good Hope in 1488, opening up a practical, if long, sea route to the east that would eventually be completed by Vasco da Gama in 1497 and 1498. By the 1490s, Europeans knew that they could sail to Asia, and they also knew, contrary to common thought, that the world was round. So many began to question whether or not there was a route to the Indies that was shorter and faster than the trip around Africa. One such man who asked this question was Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus, or Cristoforo Colombo, as his name would be rendered in Italian, was born in Genoa in 1451. Columbus was born into a family of humble means, and he left home at a young age to become a mariner, sailing across the Mediterranean and as far north as the British Isles, and as far south as the West African coast, where he visited the Portuguese factory of Elmina, discussed previously. As a sailor, Columbus fought in naval battles, but he also transported and traded goods. As a trader, Columbus saw the value of selling goods from the east, and he began to research and calculate a new route for Asia by sailing westward. It is worth noting that Columbus had almost no formal education, and most of his knowledge was self-taught. Columbus petitioned European monarchs to sponsor his voyages. King John II of Portugal rejected Columbus's proposal, believing, rightly so, that he had miscalculated the circumference of the earth. Columbus sent his brother to petition King Henry VII of England, but his brother was captured by pirates and waylaid. Columbus petitioned King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain for support of his mission to the Indies in 1492. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, who had recently married, unifying their realms to create the Kingdom of Spain, were looking to distinguish themselves in their new country. As an aside, the Spanish dialect spoken by the people of Castile, Castilian, would become the official legal language of the nascent Spanish Empire, helping to unite disparate colonies spread across the world. Language is a key tool of empire. The young monarchs, under the counsel of their advisors, initially turned Columbus down, but they changed their minds as they were looking to distinguish themselves in their new kingdom, as I said before. Columbus had already left Spain and was en route to petition the King of France when he received word that the Spanish monarchs had changed their mind. Ferdinand and Isabella agreed to sponsor Columbus, partially on the condition that he would spread Christianity to the Indies. Religion was very important to Ferdinand and Isabella, who had just captured Granada, the last Moorish Islamic stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula, completing the centuries-long Reconquista, or the retaking of Iberia by Christian Europeans. The Reconquista would loom large in Iberian, particularly Christian culture, for centuries after 1492, and the Reconquista experience would define their approach to colonialism as well. Columbus himself also wanted to spread Christianity to the east, and he hoped that the profits from his journeys would be used by Christian Europeans to recapture the holy city of Jerusalem, then controlled by the Islamic Mamluk Sultanate. Although Columbus was living in the Renaissance, he was still very much a medieval man in his desire to initiate the Crusades and retake Jerusalem, which would have been very appealing for him, especially after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, when Columbus was 2 years old. Ferdinand and Isabella promised to make Columbus admiral or viceroy, ruler of all the lands that he discovered and claimed for Spain and the Indies. On 3rd August 1492, Columbus, with 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, left Palos de la Frontera on Spain's southwest coast, sailing westward. His ships briefly docked in the Canary Islands and took on more supplies before they continued to the west. Spain's colonization of the Canaries is also a fascinating topic, but is a bit beyond the scope of this course. Columbus and his men sailed for over a month after leaving the Canaries, and his crew contemplated mutiny as they worried that they would be lost at sea and run out of provisions before being able to reach Asia or return to Spain. On October 7, 1492, their fears were assuaged with the cries of "Tierra," land, from the crow's nest. Columbus and his men had not reached East Asia. They had arrived in the Bahama Islands, off the coast of what is now Florida. Columbus named the island he landed on San Salvador, but the natives called it Wanahani. Columbus and his men called the inhabitants of San Salvador and the surrounding islands members of the Arawak and Taino peoples, Indios, or Indians, believing they had reached India. This is a modern recreation of a map that Columbus might have used when he planned his expedition to sail west across the Atlantic Ocean to Asia. As you can see from the map, not only is Columbus unaware of the existence of North America and South America, and not only does he not understand the structure of the East Asian coast, he also massively underestimates the size of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. In fact, Columbus is completely unaware of the existence of the Pacific Ocean. Also of note, the land marked Cathay here is supposed to be China. Cathay was a common term used in the 1400s for China, and Sapangu is supposed to be Japan. Sapangu is a common term used by Europeans in the 1400s to refer to Japan. And Columbus, when he initially reached the islands in the Caribbean, he believed he'd landed on the coast of Cipangu, or Japan. This is a book used by Columbus. Columbus was a self-taught scholar. He liked to make notes, what are often called marginalia, on the sides of the books he read. These are notes made by Columbus here and here, also on this side as well. When you understand that Columbus was a self-educated person, the calculation errors he made in planning his voyages are a lot more understandable. This is the flag used by Columbus on his first voyage to the Americas. In addition to the flag of Castile and Aragon, he also carried this flag. The green symbolizes the cross and Columbus's desire to spread Christianity to Asia, or what he believed was Asia, but was actually a new set of continents. And the F and the Y are a reference to Ferdinand and Isabella. Isabella's name sometimes is spelled with a Y instead of an I. Here are recreations of two of Columbus's ships, specifically the Nina and the Pinta. You can see just how small these vessels are that were used to sail across the Atlantic Ocean. Keep in mind that Columbus expected to sail across the Atlantic Ocean and reach Asia. The Nina, shown here on the left, is about 65 feet long. And the Pinta, shown here and right, is about 85 feet long. These modern replicas of Columbus's ships are fully functional, and they've sailed across the world. This is a modern recreation of the Santa Maria, the flagship of Columbus's first voyage. It's about 95 feet in length, so it's larger than the Nina and the Pinta. This ship was on display in the Scioto River in downtown Columbus for many years, although it has since been moved. Columbus noticed that the people of the Bahama Islands were peaceful and quick to learn Spanish, although he observed that many of them bore scars from attacks from other native tribes, who tried to take the islanders as slaves. This realization apparently inspired Columbus to suggest the San Salvadorians and other Indios might make good slaves for the Spanish. In terms of the language you used at the beginning of the video, push factors for Columbus and his followers would have been a lack of economic, religious, and military opportunities in Iberia, as the Reconquista came to an end and Spanish rule was centralized under one crown. Pull factors would have been the allure of wealth in the supposed Indies, gold, and a desire to convert the Indians, and eventually Indian slave labor. Now we'll discuss the indigenous people of the Caribbean that Columbus and his followers came into contact with on their voyages. These are the Arawak people. The Arawak people lived across the Caribbean region and were generally a more peaceful society, as noted by Columbus and people who came after him. They lived in homes, open-air homes made of grasses. They hunted, they fished, they kept birds and a species of dog that did not bark as pets, and they also roasted meat on grills called barracas. Barracas would eventually evolve into barbecue in subsequent centuries, mixing indigenous, African, and European cooking methods. Here is a modern photograph of Arawak people. The majority of the Arawak people died out in the Caribbean islands as a result of disease and exploitation and mistreatment by Europeans. But some Arawak people would continue to live on the northern coast of South America and parts of what is now Brazil as well. In fact, we think that the Arawak people did not come from North America south into the Caribbean, but rather they came from South America and traveled by water northward into the Caribbean islands. We think this based on genetic testing done on remains found in the Caribbean region compared to living indigenous people, and also by studying the material culture of Caribbean indigenous cultures and comparing it to the material cultures of indigenous people in North America and South America. Here are regions in South America from where we think the Arawak people might have come. As I mentioned on a previous slide, the Arawak probably came from South America, moving northward into the Caribbean region. They did not come from North America. That is what scholars think today. Here are some images of what the Carib people would have looked like. The Caribs were another group of people that were encountered by Columbus and subsequent Europeans. Their life ways were fairly similar to those of the Arawak. They had very similar material culture. They ate similar diets. They lived in similar types of homes. But we think that the Carib people were probably a lot more warlike and militaristic, based on what Columbus said in his reports about his voyages, and then in some of the archaeological excavations we've done of Carib sites. We also think that the Carib people came from northern South America, like the Arawak. You can see these regions here in orange are where we think the Carib people originally migrated from in northern South America, moving northward into the Caribbean islands. This is a shell axe head found on the island of Tobago. The island of Tobago is off the coast of what is now Venezuela, and the island of Tobago was inhabited by the Carib people. And finding an axe head like this is a reminder that the Carib people were probably more warlike than the Arawaks, their neighbors. This is a map of the Caribbean region. You can see where the Arawaks here are living. The Arawaks are living throughout the island of Cuba and a large portion of Hispaniola. It's also believed that the Caribs lived in parts of what are now Puerto Rico. And then, as I mentioned, they also lived on the island of Tobago as well. So generally speaking, the Arawaks live more in the Western Caribbean, and the Caribs live more in the Eastern Caribbean. This is a map of Columbus's first voyage. He encounters people in what is now the Bahama Islands, shown here. Then he makes his way down to Cuba. During this period, he's dealing mostly with Arawak people. As he sails further to the east, he's still in contact with Arawak people, but it's possible that he also came in contact with Carib people on the eastern portion of the island of Hispaniola at the Golfo de las Flechas, or Bay of the Arrows. It was said that the indigenous people shot arrows at Columbus's ships. Columbus and his crew also set up a settlement called La Navidad, or Christmas, on the western side of Hispaniola in what is now Haiti. The La Navidad settlement will be destroyed, though. It will be replaced with the settlement of La Isabella, which will be built further to the east in Hispaniola. In all, Columbus led 4 expeditions to the Americas. His first mission, which was mostly peaceful, was a success, but later voyages would prove more controversial, not only to modern onlookers, but to Columbus's contemporaries as well. Columbus's second voyage saw him lead an expedition of over 1,200 colonists, with the plan of establishing permanent colonies across the West Indies. That same year, Catholic Pope Julius II divided up the New World between the Catholic monarchies of Spain and Portugal in the Treaty of Tordesillas. Upon arriving in the Caribbean, Columbus found his settlement on Hispaniola had been destroyed, after the settlers, seeking gold, had angered the natives. Columbus and his settlers made new settlements on Cuba and Hispaniola, and established the Encomienda System, a form of unfree labor which enslaved non-Christian inhabitants on the islands. Columbus and his settlers also set up a colony on the island of Borican, now known as Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was the first European colony that would eventually become part of the United States. This is a map of Columbus's second voyage. As mentioned on a previous slide, Columbus returned to the Caribbean with a much larger exploration party, over 1,000 people. He returned to Hispaniola to find that La Navidad had been destroyed, presumably because the settlers Columbus had left behind had provoked the indigenous people into destroying the settlement. Columbus ends up building a new settlement on Hispaniola called La Isabella. In addition to that, he explores other islands during his second voyage. The second settlement on Hispaniola, La Isabella, was built during Columbus's second voyage in about 1494. It was built further to the east than La Navidad. It was built in what is now the Dominican Republic. You can see a artist's rendering of what La Isabella may have looked like here on the slide. The La Isabella settlement was larger than the older, destroyed La Navidad settlement. It had walls, it had a church, it also had a fortified house for Admiral Columbus to live in. At La Isabella, both men and women from the so-called Old World lived. There's also evidence that African people lived at La Isabella as well. Skeletal remains taken from the early colonists at the settlement reveal that many of the people died from disease. We also think that the first influenza epidemic in the Americas took place in La Isabella. La Isabella will ultimately be abandoned by about the year 1500 after gold was discovered on the southern side of Hispaniola Island, and Spanish colonists began to relocate to what is now Santo Domingo on the south side of Hispaniola. This is the foundation of Columbus's house at La Isabella. Here is the cemetery at La Isabella. By studying the skeletal remains of the colonists of La Isabella, we can learn a lot about how they lived. We can learn some of the foods they would have eaten, if they were malnourished. We can also learn if they died of disease or if they were perhaps killed in combat with indigenous people. We can learn a lot by studying human remains as historians. We've also learned that along with European Spanish people, there were people of African descent as well. It's unclear if those people had been living in Spain before they came to La Isabella, or if they came from Africa to La Isabella. The Encomienda system in the Spanish Caribbean colonies was extremely harsh and saw many native workers die from overworking, abuse, starvation, and disease. Additionally, by 1494, about 2/3 of Columbus's colonists in Hispaniola and Cuba had died from disease, starvation, or in skirmishes with the island's indigenous inhabitants. Contributing to these battles, Columbus had captured and enslaved almost 1,500 Arawak people, including women and children, who were transported back to Spain to be sold as slaves. About 40% of them died on this forced journey. Indigenous people, forced to work in the Encomienda system, engaged in a variety of types of labor. Early on, they engaged in mining of precious metals, particularly gold. As the mines played out, they were moved to agricultural labor. Indigenous laborers who tried to escape from the encomiendas could face very harsh punishments from their Spanish overlords, including whippings, beatings, mutilation, torture, and being attacked by dogs. along with executions as well. It was a very harsh system that was certainly resisted by indigenous people, but even criticized by Europeans as well as being too harsh and getting in the way of the goal of spreading Christianity to the people of the Americas. Columbus returned to Spain in 1496, but the death of the colonists, combined with the slaving, angered the Spanish monarchy, who felt that these issues prevented the Christianization of the quote-unquote New World. To make matters worse, Columbus refused to believe that he had not reached East Asia, even as others began to realize that he had in fact discovered a whole new part of the world. Columbus's third voyage, 1498 through 1500, saw Columbus arrested by Spanish imperial authorities for his violence against both Indians and his own colonists. During his third voyage, Columbus explored the northern coast of South America, as you can see here. In the meantime, Spanish authorities under Francisco Bobadilla arrived at Hispaniola at Santo Domingo. When Columbus arrived at Hispaniola, Bobadilla had Columbus arrested and put in chains. Bobadilla had taken testimonies from mostly the European inhabitants of Santo Domingo, who described the violence that Columbus had exhibited not only on indigenous people, but on other Europeans. All kinds of punishments, including executions and mutilations for those that challenged Columbus's authority. In recent years, some scholars have questioned whether Bobadilla embellished and exaggerated the colonists' reports of Columbus's cruelty and violence, that Bobadilla, as a Spanish person, may not have liked Columbus, an Italian. Others suggest that Bobadilla wanted to paint Columbus in as negative of a light as possible so that he could take over Columbus's position as admiral and viceroy of the Indies. Most likely what happened was Columbus was brutal and violent towards indigenous people and towards his own colonists. And also it's likely that Bobadilla did exaggerate at the same time what Columbus did. Either way, Columbus was arrested, put in chains, and taken back to Spain, where he was brought before the Spanish monarchs to answer for his crimes. The Spanish monarchy agreed to fund a fourth voyage for Columbus, but they stripped him of his title of viceroy due to his brutal mismanagement of the colonies. On his fourth voyage, 1502 through 1504, Columbus reached the North American mainland, in what is now Honduras and Panama, where he caught a glimpse of the Pacific Ocean. Columbus died on May 20th, 1506, at the age of 1504, maintaining the belief that he had found a lost part of East Asia, even as evidence mounted that he discovered a whole new landmass, the Americas. This is the route taken by Columbus on his fourth and final voyage to the Americas. As you can see, he explores the coast of Central America and the southernmost portion of North America. During this final voyage, Columbus catches a glimpse of the Pacific Ocean, probably down here in the Isthmus of Panama, where it's easier to see across to the west to the Pacific Ocean. Remember, Columbus never actually set foot in what would be the continental United States. He never set foot in, say, Florida, for example. He did visit Puerto Rico, which would become an overseas territory of the U.S., but he never actually traveled across the land that would become the mainland United States of America. The efficacy of Columbus's plan of sailing west to reach the east would not be confirmed until the voyage of Ferdinand Magellan, whose party was first to circumnavigate the globe, sailing around South America's Cape Horn, entering the Pacific, and reaching Asia before sailing back to Spain via the African coast from 1519 to 1522. Looking back, many words can be used to describe Christopher Columbus. bold explorer, self-taught scholar, and visionary, or slaver, mass murderer, and madman. In a way, all these attributes would be apt to describe this enigmatic, mercurial, and controversial figure. Columbus's discoveries paved the way for Europe's colonization of the Americas, which had a profound impact on European society and culture, changing the course of Western civilization as a whole. For the native people of the Caribbean, and indeed the Americas as a whole, Columbus and his settlers' arrival was the beginning of the end of their way of life. Their numbers were decimated by war, enslavement, exploitation, and disease. The native peoples of the Caribbean, even more so than those on the mainland, were almost completely exterminated by European colonization, particularly the Encomienda System. Columbus's discovery, or rediscovery, of the Americas would inspire subsequent waves of European colonization, which would have a profound and detrimental effect on the Native American cultures and civilizations of mainland North and South America, although their deaths would be caused primarily by disease unwittingly brought to the continent by Europeans, rather than exploitation by settlers, as was the case in the Caribbean. So, Columbus's legacy today is very mixed, to say the least. We have discussed the migration of humans from Europe to the Americas in the Age of Exploration, but we should also briefly discuss the movement of non-human plant and animal species, which were moved between the Americas and the Old World from the late 1400s onward. Europeans introduced new plant and animal species to the Americas. They introduced livestock, including cattle, pigs, chickens, and horses, the last of which became a key part of the lifeways of the Native Americans of the Great Plains. They introduced a variety of plant species as well, including apples, bananas, sugarcane, wheat, and citrus. The Europeans also brought animals like turkeys and plants like peppers, tomatoes, and potatoes back to the Old World. Although it's worth noting there were species of peppers already in the Old World. These were just new species from the Americas. This exchange of biomass between the Old and New Worlds has been called the Colombian Exchange. While the Colombian Exchange had many upsides, giving the peoples of the Americas and the Old World additional food sources and animal companions, this exchange also included the transfer of microorganisms, which spread diseases between the hemispheres. The diseases unwittingly brought to the Americas by Europeans and later Africans had a far more devastating effect on Native Americans than the contagions that were brought to the Old World from the Americas. As we go forward in this course, we will be discussing some very difficult and controversial subjects. As historians, our job is to discuss the past and learn as much as we can about why the people of the past did what they did, the world they came from, the challenges they faced, and how they viewed their surroundings. Understanding these issues does not excuse the violent or immoral acts committed by people in the past, but it can help us to learn more about human nature and how to keep such things from happening in the future. As the famous American historian Lawrence Levine once said, it is not the historian's job to pass judgment on the past, because the historian is too busy being involved in both the prosecution and the defense. That is what we will be doing in this course, considering the events and the people of the past from a variety of perspectives.